Watershed Enhancement Board. Just a heads up, so April just started the recording. We are going to record this webinar, and we're also live streaming it on the OWEB YouTube channel. So just be aware of that as you're entering questions into the chat. So we're here this afternoon to run through some of the background information and guidance for the newly launched 2020 Post-Fire Recovery Grant that OWEB is now offering. So I'll take this opportunity to essentially walk you through some different documents that outline at different levels of specificity some of the program details. I would strongly encourage you to please use the chat function. What really one of the key intents of today's session is, in addition to sharing some of the guidance information about the offering, is to understand what some of the questions are that you all have about this new offering that OWEB now has rolled out. We'll periodically throughout our time together this afternoon, I'll stop at key points and just check the chat. There may be some questions that are posed that may be relatively straightforward in nature and kind of broadly applicable to a number of folks on the phone. In those instances, I'll try to provide some answers. Now, in other cases, though, we really do want to take this opportunity to gather the questions that you have to continue to build out program materials for the 2020 Post-Fire Recovery Grants. Our hope is that the guidance document is fairly comprehensive, but we know that folks may have specific questions related to the fire impacts in their particular area, what it means in terms of mechanics of the projects they're contemplating. So really do please make healthy use of that chat function so that we can gather your questions, answer the ones that are appropriate for today, and then do some follow-up with additional program materials. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can walk through some of the materials. So April, are you able to see my screen that shows the email that circulated last week?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to step you through some of the information you may have looked at, but maybe have not had an opportunity to look at since the grant offerings were just launched last Thursday, but do want to make sure that we have some time together to walk through some of those specifics, because there are a number of important considerations as we're thinking through the right fit for different projects in terms of the 2020 fire impacted areas and subsequent natural resources recovery. So hopefully most of you received the Gov Delivery Message that went out last week. It's showing here on my screen. So just want to hit a few high points in this before we jump to some of the other pages. So you can see here that the legislature during the 21 legislative session did provide general funds to support post-fire recovery work in the 2020 fire impacted areas. So I flagged that because general fund is a fund source that OWEB typically does not have, and there are some considerations associated with that. So ultimately, we received $19.75 million in funding to help support natural resources recovery in the fire impacted areas from 2020. And you do see that we have launched the first grant cycle within this new grant program. The deadline, and I'll highlight this a few different times during our time together today, is 5 p.m. on January 31st. So we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that deadline and some of the subsequent cycles we're expecting. So in terms of the Gov Delivery Message, it does outline some key information. The eligible fire affected areas, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move into some of the other program materials. It does highlight specific actions that are eligible for funding. So while OWEB, as a restoration and conservation grantor, funds a number of different activities, these grants that are supported by the general fund provided by the legislature are very specifically focused on a few categories. So you can see those listed here: post-fire upland and riparian replanting, and then also post-fire floodplain restoration and reconnection projects. So again, we'll get into some more of the specifics of that in just a bit. The Gov Delivery does outline eligible applicants for these grant offerings. These align very well with typically the traditional OWEB grants and the eligible applicants for those. So I would just encourage all of you to check here the list of what you see, and then flagging that state and federal agencies may only apply as co-applicants with another eligible entity. And then scrolling through, there are some important considerations. We'll get into those in more detail as we walk through the guidance documents. And then flagging here in the Gov Delivery, the webinar. So again, really encourage you to ask questions using the chat so that we have an opportunity to hear and respond to some of the questions that you may have currently, and then build out those program materials. So I'm going to go ahead and jump us over now to the webpage that describes the Post-Fire Recovery Grant offering. Hopefully some of you have had a chance to take a look at this already. So in terms of some of the key pieces here, the legislative intent I already described in terms of specific natural resources recovery activities in the 2020 fire impacted areas. These grants are supported by general fund. And I do want to underscore this piece right here, really strong focus on the ground implementation activities. So while we recognize that efforts such as stakeholder engagement or landowner engagement have likely been important work that you all have been undertaking, the intent of these dollars is really to have the vast majority of the funding go to on the ground implementation activities. So just wanted to flag that for you now. We do outline here the eligible 2020 fire impacted areas. You'll see this bulleted list of 13 fires. One note, I'm not sure that we have anyone from the Holiday Farm fire area on, but I do want to flag that for the initial round, at a minimum, for the competitive grant offerings, Holiday Farm fire area is not eligible, simply because as part of a separate pot of funding that the legislature is also directing through OWEB, Eugene Water and Electric Board is slated to receive direct pass-through funding for natural resources recovery in the Holiday Farm fire area. So just wanted to flag that for you. And also strong emphasis, I know at least one or two folks on the phone may be in areas that have seen fire impacts prior to 2020 and since 2020. But again, just underscoring that these legislatively allocated dollars really are focused on 2020 fire impacted areas. So in terms of the eligible activities, getting into some more specifics, and we'll again dig even more deeply into those in the program guidance. So the few categories that I mentioned, so we have the post-fire upland and riparian replanting as one category. And really here, looking for comprehensive replanting projects. So that can include site prep, planting, plant stewardship to ensure that we get those replanting projects to somewhere close to free to grow. A really key piece that you'll see in both of the offerings is an explicit link that you'll need to make as applicants to where you're working and the work that you're doing and how those areas have been identified and prioritized through assessments and analyses that were conducted post-fire. So we'll talk just in a bit about some of those specific examples of assessments or analyses that you may look to. But then also the intent of this really is for these dollars to help address priority erosion and water quality issues for drinking water supply, source water areas, and important aquatic habitats. So just continue to apply that lens as you're thinking about the projects and the areas where you're working. The second category is post-fire floodplain restoration and reconnection projects. So again, strong focus on implementation work. These projects do tend to be more complex in nature. So again, connecting the proposed work in terms of floodplain restoration or reconnection to areas that have been identified and prioritized following post-fire assessments or analyses, and also really thinking through how the proposed projects would help to address water quality concerns and also help to reduce post-fire flood risk. So that is a slight difference between those two categories of activities. We already hit on the eligible applicants. So where we'll spend much of our time is running through these two guidance documents that we've developed as part of the program resources, and they'll get into some more specifics. In terms of the funding that was provided by the legislature, $10.75 million is set aside for the upland and riparian replanting category, and $5 million is set aside for the post-fire floodplain restoration and reconnection work. So just to give you a sense of how those funds are distributed. And then the webpage does provide some additional information about the deadline for the first cycle that we're providing during these offerings, and then does give you a sense. Our intent is to have it at a minimum 2 grant cycles for this funding. We will open that in early April of 22 and have a slightly narrower timeline for that, with a deadline of May 31st of 22. We recognize that folks in some fire areas may not quite be ready by the end of January, potentially, to submit an application. So want to provide space for folks who might need to do a little bit more work with project development. And then we'll track resource availability following that second cycle and determine if a third cycle is warranted. If that is the case, then it would be a relatively short application timeframe during summer of 22. So that's, it's great that someone popped a question into the chat, because this is one of the times I wanted to stop and just check the chat and see what questions folks have. So John typed in floodplain project question in terms of, will funding allow for design, permitting, implementation? Can it apply to more than one site in a burn area? So great question. So yes, John, I'll get to that first piece in terms of design, permitting, and implementation. And quick answer is yes. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the program guidance document. And definitely, as you're thinking about your projects, I recognize that you may be working in, in some cases, not massive areas in terms of post-fire recovery work. In other cases, much larger areas. If we think about the footprints of fires like Beachy Creek as an example, if you are doing similar actions such as replanting, then yes, you can combine that into a single grant application, knowing though that when we get to questions around project design, as one example, you'll need to provide some specifics about each site where you're working. But we do want to be mindful about the fact that you all are incredibly busy working with landowners, planning projects, implementing work on the ground, so don't want to have too cumbersome a grant application process. So where we can find some of those efficiencies and knowing you'll have to have sufficient documentation, definitely encourage you to package up multiple sites into a single grant application where appropriate. And then Autumn is asking about maximum grant amounts that we can apply for, project completion deadline. Maximum grant amount, we have not set a maximum. We recognize that the different fire areas experience different impacts. So, smaller grants may make sense in some cases. Much bigger grants, especially if you're talking about a floodplain restoration or reconnection project that tend to be complex and a bit more expensive, may be something that's justifiable. So we're not setting a max. Autumn, I think, and we'll get to that shortly, I think the key is really around being able to demonstrate applicant and local partner capacity to carry out whatever projects you are proposing and the scale for those. Project completion deadline, that I'll get into shortly, so I'll hold that one. And if I forget to hit on that when I'm talking about lifespan of funds, Autumn, please just pop another question into the chat and it'll prompt me. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the overview and guidance document for the program. And so this really is where most of the meat around guidance is. And Rebecca, I'll get to your question. Perfect timing. It's right here in the document, so hold tight on that. So a few pieces to flag here, and I'm only going to hit on those items that we've not yet touched on previously, but I do strongly encourage you to please take a very close look at all of the guidance documents, because there may be nuances that apply to your area that you'll be wanting to think through. So the question that Rebecca posed is a great one. So you can see here that the legislative intent for this funding really does prioritize work on non-federal lands, private, state, tribal lands. So county is fine, Rebecca. I would say that the legislative intent prioritizes funding on non-federal lands if there are exceptional situations where, to address an area where there's incredible erosion risk, you're taking an all lands approach, there may be some justification for blending federal lands into that. But I would say that throughout the conversations during the 2021 legislative session, the intent with these legislative dollars was to not have anywhere close to the lion's share going to federal lands, really trying to help fill those gaps that tribal lands, private lands, state lands, county lands are facing. So Rebecca, I would say, as you all get into developing an application, we may want to talk offline about that mix of county, federal, private. So when I say hit on that piece, so I'll just walk through this page by page. So the fire areas are again noted here. We do get into some more specifics about each of the eligible activity types. So we'll start with the upland and riparian planting section. So, you've seen this language before on the webpage, for example, addressing priority erosion and water quality concerns. Here, though, is where we provide some examples of those assessments and analyses that folks will want to point to in describing what have we learned in terms of post-fire impacts, what areas are of particular interest or concern, and how is the proposed project crosswalking to those priorities that have been identified. So that could be information from BEAR reports, from the BLM ES&R reports. Some of the data layers in those reports will take a broader view of considerations such as soil burn severity, in some cases vegetation mortality. In some basins, the ETART reports were completed last fall, so definitely if that happened in your area, take advantage of that. And then we recognize that there are really helpful data layers and reports from partner agencies such as Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, Oregon Department of Forestry, and that in some cases there were locally conducted assessments. So wanting to make sure that your proposed projects are well grounded in quantitative information about what those impacts look like across the fire area, and then how you're targeting your prioritized work. So then getting into some of the specifics about the replanting projects, we already talked about the comprehensive nature and strong encouragement for that. A few pieces that I want to flag. So treatment of invasive species is an allowable cost if it's part of a comprehensive replanting project. If you're proposing to just go in and do early detection, rapid response, but without any planting piece to this, replanting piece of this, that's not an eligible activity. Long story short, when we were describing the natural resources recovery needs, there were a whole host of needs described to the legislature. Certain pieces of those were popped out and funded. And so invasive treatment really should be considered as part of an overall comprehensive replanting project for it to be eligible under these grants. Similarly, exclusion fencing is allowable so long as it is connected to essentially protecting that replanting investment. So fencing, simply replacing fencing is not an eligible activity. If you're combining that with replanting activities, modest fencing costs are eligible. Just note that you'll need to provide some details about the fencing. So all of that's in the grant application. So then moving into the floodplain activity type. So again, you'll see similar information in terms of the requirement to connect the proposed activities to assessment and analyses that have been completed about those fire impacts. And then we get into some of the additional specifics about the sub-activities, if you will, that are eligible within this offering. So John, to your point, late stage project design is an eligible activity so long as you are doing that as part of then proposing, this is the implementation work, this is the on the ground work that we'll be carrying out. We do flag that it is late stage design that is eligible. If you are just now for the first time starting to think about what a floodplain reconnection project work in my basin, the lifespan of these dollars are probably not a good fit. If it's something where you're farther down the road in that, you need to get into some specifics about project design, apologies for my barking dog, then that is an eligible cost. And then going back to the replanting topic, if you are doing earth moving work or materials placement work that constitutes a floodplain restoration or reconnection project, you then can do replanting on top of that, but please do not come into this offering if all you're doing is proposing replanting on floodplain. That was not the intent of these dollars, but if it does fit there, you're doing some earth moving, would like to do replanting on top of that, replanting is an eligible cost, and then same situation with invasive treatment and fencing as noted above in the replanting section. I'm going to check my notes here. So now then moving into a few things that those folks who are familiar with OWEB we want to make sure to flag for you out the gates because these are a bit different. So general funds normally have a 2-year lifespan. We already have started the wheels turning on requesting from the legislature to have these funds carried into the next biennium, but we do not have an answer for that. So really all of you as potential applicants need to be thinking about what is your capacity to plan and implement these restoration projects over potentially a short time frame, as few as 15 months possibly, but maybe as long as 3 years if we are allowed to carry forward those dollars into next biennium. So please be thinking about that. And then in terms of match, we strongly encourage 25% match, but we will certainly entertain applications that have less than that. So just wanted to make you aware of that. So I think what I'll do actually is stop and take a quick look at a couple of these questions. Josh, I think you're asking lead management. So if you are proposing to use this new offering, weed management on those previously treated areas would only be eligible if you are reseeding, replanting those areas. So we might want to talk separately about some of the specifics of what you're seeing. So if it's just using these dollars to do more weed treatment, no, there would have to be replanting or reseeding combined with that. If you're talking about using previous OWEB funds for match on these, yes, we can do that because these are general fund dollars, but let's maybe talk about that separately. Yes, Rebecca, properties that are enrolled in EFRP are eligible. I think the key with that, and again, we might want to talk separately, is ensuring that what you're proposing to this new grant offering is the right fit, given eligible activities relative to what might be left out of the EFRP plan. John, interesting question about the funds between the two funding cycles. We actually don't, we have not set a particular cap for that. So we are encouraging folks to come in early if you're able to come in during this first cycle. But if you need more time for project development, please reach out so that we know you have something in the works and can be thinking through how much funding may need to be protected or set aside for a future cycle. If folks have not been able to come in the door, one thing we don't want to do is shut areas out. But we also do need to ensure that these dollars are moving in a reasonable time frame. So we are not setting particular targets or caps. We need to see what essentially the demand on the program is. We don't have a great handle on that yet. And then County Park, Thomas, I would want to have some more specifics about a county park that is leased from federal partners. So let's talk about that separately. And I think, so April, flag anything. Oh, I did miss Autumn. You had asked the question about the project completion deadline. That will hinge on what the ultimate lifespan of these dollars is. Our expectation is that if we're able to get approval to carry this funding forward into next biennium, we would still need to have all of the funding allocated in grant awards before June 30th of 2023. The most optimistic I think we could be in terms of the ultimate lifespan, ideal lifespan of these dollars is June 30th of 2025. So, probably three years, so that you would then have time for wrap up, completing all billing, getting project completion reports in by the end of next biennium. But certainly we will stay in close communication with local partners as we get more clarity from the legislature about the potential for carry forward into next biennium. And then, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and keep moving through here. So in terms of the grant cycles and grant making considerations piece, again, talking about the cycle information, this next text is in red for a very good reason, which is and this is true for all OWEB grants, we strongly encourage you to submit your grant applications at least 24 hours before the deadline. We have verification process built into our grant applications that if a piece of information is missing, you've missed an upload, it kicks that back. You need time to fix that, and we want to make sure you have time to fix that. I say the 24-hour submission is strongly encouraged because once we hit that 5 p.m. deadline on each of the cycle end dates, we will not make exceptions to grant applications being received. We want to keep a level playing field in that way. So just feel it's important to always highlight that for folks. John had asked the question about divvying up the amounts across cycles. We have not done that. We've also not set aside particular amounts for specific fire areas. We understand the broad geographic impact from the 2020 fire season, and we understand that each fire is unique. So we have not said X fire will get this much, Y fire will get that much. We need to see what demand on these dollars looks like as it relates to high priority impacted areas and funding available. So just so that you know, it's not as though a particular fire is having more or less set aside. And then we did just talk about the general fund and the carry forward piece here. So that piece is critically important as we better understand the leaning of the legislature on that front. We'll keep you all posted about that. So moving into page 3, just a few other important considerations. As with most OWEB grants, all OWEB grants, these dollars are not intended to fill gaps in terms of costs for activities that are required under existing regulations. So I put in one example in terms of the Forest Practices Act here. If there's a piece of property, it has experienced salvage logging, needs to be replanted, that's a requirement under the Forest Practices Act. These dollars cannot be used to do that replanting. So just wanted to make sure that, given the different partners you may be working with in your fire area, that consideration is upfront in terms of existing regulations. We really do encourage local partners to the degree possible to coordinate, to really leverage strengths of different organizations to try to maximize both the efficiency of this work and the effectiveness of the on-the-ground work. If it's possible to coordinate activities, if you have a strong local partnership and you could put some number of activities or different sites into a single grant application for replanting as one example, we are open to that, and I'm happy to help you kind of work through what the structure of that would be. But I think really the key here is trying to encourage a well-coordinated approach in these fire areas that hits highest priority needs, as opposed to a set of one-offs that may be disconnected and may not be hitting particularly high priority areas. As with all OWEB grants, we really strongly encourage you to read all of the guidance documents, make heavy use of the I buttons that are in the online grant applications. This really will help you to know what's expected of me as I'm answering these questions, what uploads are required of me. So please do make sure that you're tracking that closely. And if questions come up about that, feel free to reach out. And then this piece is important in addition to the project completion reporting that Autumn asked about. Because of the strong legislative interest in these general fund dollars being used to help with natural resources recovery, we are going to be requiring both quarterly billing and quarterly reporting on these grants. We will work our hardest to make sure that the quarterly reporting is not burdensome. It's pretty straightforward in terms of where you're at going through that plan for implementation, because we will be asked on a quarterly basis to report up to the governor's office and the legislature about progress on recovery with these funds being used to support that. So just from a full transparency standpoint, wanted to make sure that that was out there. So in terms of actually I'm going to check here since it's a reasonable breaking point. I'm not seeing any new questions, so I'll go ahead and we'll wrap up this document before we jump over to the fiscal document. So in terms of the grant program evaluation process, because of the nice relationship to the existing administrative rules for OWEB restoration grants, those really will serve as kind of a foundation, if you will, for the evaluation process. But there are some nuanced considerations that we'll make as we're going through the evaluation process. So demonstrated need for the proposed actions based on those assessments and analyses that I mentioned, showing why those are priority areas given the post-fire impacts that have been documented. For the replanting projects, expected benefits, really helping to connect the dots between what you're proposing and soil stabilization needs, any water quality concerns that exist for drinking water areas, source water areas, and then water quality concerns for important aquatic habitat. For floodplain, similar in terms of the soil stabilization, water quality considerations, but then also recognizing that post-fire flood risks in particular areas might really help to justify why a floodplain project might make sense in particular locations, in particular basins. Other considerations, again, this aligns to our restoration grant administrative rules, but really determining that there is organizational capacity, whether it's a single organization or a set of organizations partnering together to successfully complete the proposed work in a limited time frame, given the general fund lifespan of these dollars. Again, coordination among local partners to ensure that highest priority areas are being hit, and then coordination with federally recognized tribes throughout the recovery process, and communications with the legislature, natural and cultural resources were closely tied together. So I think proactive communication, and I know many of you are already doing that with federally recognized tribes, is an important consideration with these grants. And then finally, you'll see in the grant applications, there are some questions around equity and climate impact. So, how are you thinking through I'll give an example, if you're doing a replanting project, how are you thinking about, given anticipated climate impacts, what are the species assemblages that may or may not make sense as you're structuring your replanting project? So there will be some consideration given to both climate and equity responses in the evaluation process. So we'll convene a statewide team of agency staff with broad knowledge of natural resources recovery, and also good understanding of organizational capacity and coordination needed to do this type of work, especially on a quick timeline. We will, though, I think this is important given the diversity of areas impacted by the 2020 fires, we'll make sure to be checking up and down with agency reps in the fire affected area to make sure that the statewide team really does have a more intimate understanding of those local recovery needs. And then finally, the program guidance does include some additional resources. So one, just the standard OWEB application guidance. This provides a lot of helpful information about how do you get access to the online application system? What are some helpful hints as you're filling out applications? So for those folks less familiar with OWEB grant making, definitely encourage you to take a look at that. We do have some training videos for folks who are less familiar with interacting with OWEB, and cover a whole host of topics from how to use our online applications to what are the insurance requirements to what are some of the fiscal management considerations. And then we do have a couple folks from partner agencies, both DEQ and Department of Forestry, who, as you are thinking through plans for your projects and whether that's what are those priority areas relative to water quality considerations or what are some of those replanting considerations, folks at DEQ and ODF are available to help provide some technical information to you. Also, we're working with the folks at OSU Fire Extension Program to provide some additional data layers to the wildfire map tool that they already have to help make some of the water quality information more accessible to you. And then, of course, you can contact me as you're working through project development. So before we jump over to the fiscal document, I'll take a look. I think only Autumn has added a question. Autumn, it's a great question. So she's asking about the funding becoming available for the 2021 wildfires. I don't have an answer to that. 2020 was a bit exceptional in that the scale of the fire did result in a trigger for a presidential disaster declaration, which then caused the entire state recovery plan to activate. So certainly there was a lot of attention on the 2020 fires for those reasons. I don't want to suggest that folks are not thinking about what has just happened earlier this year. The mechanics were a little bit different. I know the governor's office is in discussion with agencies, local partners, the legislature about what resources might be available to help with the 2021 wildfires. I just don't know enough about what the structure of that might take if funding is made available. But as we know more on that front, we'll keep you posted. Yeah, so Rebecca, let's talk separately about the forest landowner piece, because I want to make sure that we're looping in folks from ODF so that we are mindful of what those requirements are under the existing regulation in the Form of Forest Practices Act, but not being overly rigid when there may not be resources available in some cases for a non-industrial private landowner, for example, to replant. So I'd prefer to follow up separately to understand some of the specifics of that situation and loop in ODF. But that's a great example of something that as we kind of work through an example in that case, we can put that information into a frequently asked questions document. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump us over then, being mindful of time, to this document, which is, so for folks familiar with OWEB, you're familiar with the Go Big document, so guidance on budgeting and grants, and we have created a supplemental Go Big document specific to the post-fire recovery program. So I do want to encourage all of you to take a look at that, the standard fiscal guidance document, which is linked here, but knowing that because of the fund source, the time frame, the expectations around these dollars, there are some minor differences. So we did want to make sure to flag those. So with that, the pieces, and I know one of these pieces will probably make many of you very, very happy to hear, but I want to hit on just a few things. So again, these are general fund dollars. So things like time frame, legislative intent need to be front of mind as we're granting out these dollars. The emphasis here really is for on the ground work. If you need to do some of that late stage design, for example, that John asked about in floodplain projects, that is an acceptable cost, but other things, and we'll get into some of these down here, are not eligible costs. The key piece I want to highlight here, but not to minimize the others, is this, which probably will make many of you happy. If you propose a project that is awarded funding following the evaluation process, and it is something that frankly you all have been working on since, I mean, for several months, but we'll say August 6th, 2021, which was the date when the bill that provided this funding was signed by the governor, then you actually can claim costs retroactively, eligible costs for eligible activities back to that August 6th date. So I'll just, because Rebecca's the last chat comment that I'm seeing, if Rebecca's been working honestly since March of last year on replanting projects with folks in the North Santiam, for those projects that you might put into a grant application and propose under this particular offering, costs that happened back to as far as August 6th of 2021 are things that we could retroactively reimburse you for. You'll still have to have the same receipt requirements. You'll still need to prove up documentation for that, but just recognizing that we don't want to limit folks' ability to get reimbursed for critical work that's been happening on the ground because it took us some time to stand up a grant program after all of the approvals were given for these funds. So just wanted to flag that piece, and happy to kind of talk through specifics as you are putting together your applications and thinking through what that means, given the work you've been doing. So there are a set of activities that are not allowable within this particular program. So some of the ineligibles are things like contingencies, promotional materials, and extensive stakeholder engagement activities. We are not allowing equipment usage rates, but there are some allowables around equipment purchase and equipment rental rates. You'll just need to provide the necessary documentation, and you may have some questions from fiscal folks that come up. So just make sure you're paying attention to these pieces that might be different for this particular program. Indirect costs are capped at 10%, regardless of other negotiated rates. This is, again, going back to the legislature's intent of really maximizing these dollars being applied to on-the-ground activities. So indirects are capped at a 10% maximum. And then there is encouragement to try to minimize indirect costs, in several words, and contracts within a proposed project, really to just focus the resources on the ground. And then post-grant costs are not allowed. This piece in terms of the billing and reporting on a quarterly basis, we already touched on, but we just wanted to underscore that here. So I think, let me flip back through my notes, see if there was anything I intended to hit on and skipped over. I don't think so. So let's see if folks have other questions that they want to pop into the chat at this point, either for us, if we're able to address now, or food for thought for us to follow up on and develop FAQs around, and then we can talk about next steps. And I'm actually going to stop sharing. All right, I'm not seeing more coming into the chat, but maybe you all are furiously typing. So we'll give another minute. Okay, I'm not seeing anything else popping up. So in terms of next steps, I'll beat a dead horse again a bit. please make sure to review all of the program materials closely. Think about what that means to projects that you would be proposing to the program. If questions come up, let me know. For those of you who already are OWEB applicants or grantees, you already have access to the online grant application system. You can go in, take a look at the grant applications. You'll get a sense of the questions that are included there. You can access the grant application templates for those who have not yet applied for OWEB funding. The application guidance document that I pointed you to, the online app guidance document, helps to walk you through what the steps are to get access to the system. And then certainly feel free to reach out if you have questions as you're looking through the application, thinking about what it means for your fire affected area. We will take the questions from today, and where it's not covered in one of the existing guidance documents, we'll develop FAQs. In some cases, like the example with Rebecca's question, we'll want to actually run through the scenario to understand what it looks like, to make sure that any FAQs we're developing are well informed. And then certainly feel free to reach out. Our thinking with the January 31st deadline was that it would give you time to work with landowners, work with partners to develop comprehensive grant applications, but it is a pretty quick turnaround still, especially with the holidays in the mix. So if any questions come up for you, please feel free to reach out, because we want to be able to point folks in the right direction. So it looks like, since I've been burning some time talking, some other questions have popped in. So yeah, so Jenny, I think this is the question that Thomas asked too. I want some more information about the Marion County, and Thomas, I don't actually know if your question was about Marion County. I can't remember. Let's talk separately about that, because I want to understand what the situation is before responding to the question, since there is a federal overlay there. So let's plan to follow up on that one. Oh, Rebecca, thanks for that question. And we actually have structured the grant applications so that you need to select a single fire area. So that, yeah, I think it will mostly be the Lions Head, Beachy, Riverside that could get more complex, but that is the way that we've structured it. It's picking one within that list of eligible fire areas. So if we need to talk through how to connect across those, just to make sure you have a comprehensive story despite having to complete multiple applications, let's do that. Yeah, thanks for that question, Autumn, about repetitive actions. It's fine to do that. We understand that the immediate response funding, you are working to get some hoped for solutions on the ground, and sometimes those take, sometimes those don't. And so it's okay to use this funding to propose that. What we ask is a set of questions around, is this a continuation? Is this something that OWEB has provided funding to previously? So I think just being very, very transparent about what worked, what didn't, and why you're coming back to help get at some of those ongoing needs will be, it's important, and it'll be fine, because we recognize that maybe everything didn't take. And I think that covers the last of the questions. So with that, I'll give another minute in case anyone has a final question. I have a set of items here to follow up with particular folks on, just to make sure that we understand the situation and can have some follow-up conversations. Certainly, if any of you who are on the call have questions, feel free to send me an email. We can jump on the phone, kind of talk through things. I'll do my best to respond to folks quickly, not exactly sure again what the demand on this program is going to be. So if it takes a day or two for me to turn around a response, then be patient, know it's coming. This is new territory for us. We want to get it right because there is a lot of attention in a good way from the legislature on this. And I think that it's important to show how funding like this can really support critically important work by local partners. To I think Autumn's point that 2020 was exceptional, and we may continue to see post-fire recovery needs at a not insignificant scale for years to come. So I think just making sure that we do our best in terms of accountable implementation of this program is key. So Rebecca. Yeah, so Rebecca, you could, I think in this case, and we can talk through this, you'll want to think through what makes sense in terms of partnership across geographies and involving multiple organizations. It may make sense to carve some of those off because you have a constellation of folks who work on North Santiam issues and a different constellation of folks that may or may not have, some connections across. We don't want you to shoehorn all the activities for Beachy into a single grant application if it doesn't make sense. What we would encourage you to do is if you're thinking about the council and the district and the county and state forest in the North Santiam, that may be the better organizing approach than tackling all of Beachy. There does not have to be a single application for only Beachy, but you can only pick one fire as you're filling out your grant application. So hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't, let's definitely follow up on that one. And yes, Autumn, we are definitely fortunate. I think we all benefited from the fact that there was a windfall of funding late during the legislative session. But that said, the legislature, from the day it convened, was very focused on post-fire recovery needs, not just for natural resources, but community capacity, economic development, infrastructure, and that windfall towards the end of session really just helped to provide some resources to fill those gaps that you all had helped us to uncover and share with legislators throughout session. So thanks to each of you for helping to tell your stories so that it was clear what the need was, and we were able to secure some funding for the natural resources side of things. So with that, folks, we have about 6 minutes left. I'm not going to keep you on unnecessarily. So take a look at the materials that are available online. Feel free to reach out if questions come up. And then for the folks who post questions that I couldn't respond to, I'll take this and do some follow-up throughout the next several days with you all so we can run down answers to those and begin to build out that supplemental FAQ document for the program. So thanks for taking time out of your Monday afternoon to join us, and thank you, April, for helping with the webinar. Take care, everyone.